Are you just starting out playing drums? Or maybe you're like me and you just have no idea what you're doing, but you love hitting things. I'm sure you've asked yourself, how come some snares cost $6,000, some cost $600, some cost 15 bucks? So let's talk about snare drums. What makes a good snare? What makes a cheap snare? And find out if cheap snares are actually good. This snare is my favorite cheap snare. It's a PDP main stage snare. PDP is the cheaper subsidiary of DW drums. What makes it cheaper? DW drums are handmade in the United States of America. PDP drums are semi-handmade somewhere in a Chinese factory. In addition to being not 100% handmade, it has cheaper hardware. Although these black aluminum lugs look really nice, and it's one of the reasons I bought this drum. They are aluminum. They're not as tough, they're not going to stand up to as much abuse. They'll probably dent if I threw this drum. You may think, who's going to throw your drums? But if you're playing on a stage with other musicians, you never know what's going to happen. The heads are made in China. Even though this is a Remo head, it's still made in China, just branded with the Remo name. It's the same white coated head that you get with any cheap drum. The snare wires are no-name, cheap steel snare wires. The throw-off is probably the worst throw-off in the world. Anytime that I adjust it, I am terrified that it's just going to completely fall apart. It will someday. And in fact, DW doesn't even put this type of throw-off on their snares anymore. Even the cheap snares have a better throw-off than this. I would just switch it out, but to make it cheaper, for some reason they thought they could just throw these crazy bolts on the sides here instead of 2 bolts down the center, like every other throw-off in existence. Other than that, it's a pretty nice wood shell. It's not as hand-finished inside, it's not waxed or sealed or stained like handmade drums, but it's still very smooth. The bearing edge is relatively smooth. There are a few imperfections and nicks, but overall it looks really good. If you were to put a good head on the top and on the bottom, put some good snare wires on here, you would get a really good sound. In fact, out of the box, with all cheap parts on it, it still sounds pretty good. Since there's no snare beds on this drum, and the rim is completely flush throughout, there's no place for these snare plates to sit when they come all the way over here. They'll end up sitting on the wood, so when you tighten it up, they lift up, snares come off the drum, they never touch the drum and you never get any snares, you just get a terrible sounding tiny tom. It saves money by not cutting a snare bed, but how do you make it a snare? Well, this 14-inch drum uses a 13-inch snare wire, and it seems to work just fine. It will mean you get less snare sound on the edge, you get less articulation for the snares around the drum. Most of the snare sound happens in the center, but I still kind of like that. It's not too bad when your drum rolls can sound like this, or this. So you can take advantage of the money-saving features on a drum. The other insane place where they save money is quality control. If you look at where the snare sits in relation to the gap on the hoop, you'll see that it's not in the middle. And the fact that it's not dead center means it's a little bit harder to change your snare wires. Getting them to lay perfect, it's tough. It's going to take some extra work. It also means that when you flip the strainer up and down, sometimes it'll get a little wonky, which will cause a lot of snare buzz. It's the same thing on this side. It's not perfectly centered. It doesn't matter what you do to get it perfectly centered. In fact, on mine, I have the strap kind of off to the side of the butt plate so that it's more centered than it could be if I centered everything. This one's perfectly centered, and it sits kind of to the side. It's not centered at all in this hole where it should be. It doesn't matter that much since there's no cuts for snare beds, but it can be an issue, especially if you're one of those people who absolutely can't stand snare buzz. If you're looking at buying a cheap snare drum, you probably don't know that much about snare buzz, and I'll tell you right now, you can hear it, and it's disgusting, and you'll hate it, but no one else can hear it. You stand 5 to 10 feet away from the kit when you're playing, and it's all washed out. Well, this is my favorite snare drum, and it lacks features like snare beds. I do have other snare drums that have snare beds. However, they're not centered by any means. They're not even and they're not equal. It's probably better to have no snare beds than to have unequal, uneven snare beds. On a 14-inch drum, you can just put a 13-inch snare on there and avoid the snare bed issue entirely. But if it has messed up cut snare beds, it'll sink in and you still have snare buzz. You're not going to get rid of that. The other problem with cheap snares is that the snare wire tension moves all the time. Every time I sit down on this drum, it's in a different place, whether I touch it or not. The issue is right here. This little tuning nut, it'll just move around. There's not much you can do about it. If that doesn't move around, your cheap snares are going to stretch. Not a big deal, you sit there, tap it until you get it where you want it to be. Now, a cheap snare like this will cost you around $85. You can put a new head on the top, bottom, and new snare wires, even the cheapest new snare wires, and you'll have a really good sounding drum. This one is a 14 by 5.5. It is very pingy, and I like that. It's good for punk. I think it's good for a rock backbeat. I really enjoy the way that it sounds. I really enjoy the way that it sounds with nice heads, but it doesn't sound that bad with the stock heads. If you're watching a video on cheap snare drums, you've probably seen a lot of other videos on cheap snare drums where they compare $600 drums to $6,000 drums, and you'll notice there's a huge difference. And if you go to a drum store and you ask whoever works there to play the different snare drums, you'll notice a huge difference. But if you're contemplating buying a cheap snare drum, you won't notice that much difference when you play it. So, if you're looking for a cheap snare drum, there's no reason why you shouldn't buy one. If you can't afford it, you could probably add another $100 into your budget and get a really nice drum. But if you can't, then you can still enjoy a cheaper drum. It can still sound good, and most people won't notice that it's a cheap snare drum. If you play in a band, they probably won't notice unless they know something about drum gear. Yes, other drummers will know that you have cheap stuff. But when you use cheap stuff for a while, eventually you'll just stop caring because it'll sound the way that you want it to. And that is the real gold mine in cheap drums. If you buy a drum like this, you can mess with the tuning lugs, you can see what tuning it different ways can do. Stretch out your batter head. Stretch your snares as tight as they'll go. Let them be as loose as they can go. Play it like this, play it like this. Do whatever you want to it. Bring it to a friend's house. Bring it to the beach. Abuse it. That's what they're for. I think the main reason they make these cheap drums is so beginners can buy them and experiment with them. When you're done, you'll be left with a wood shell, some cute tuning lugs, and you can rework the entire drum if you want. You can pass it on to someone else. You can sell it. You can make a clock out of it. By the time you know how to play a good drum, you'll probably be able to afford a good drum. If you're even contemplating what makes a drum cheap, then there's no reason not to buy cheap drums. Most of the sound of a drum comes from the head. People who play drums a lot and have played for a long time will argue that point, because it's technically not true. But when you're just starting out, or you're a kid, you won't really know the difference. After you've played drums for about 6 months, you'll be able to sit down on different kits and notice the differences. That doesn't mean that the original drums sound bad. It just means your ear for hearing sound is developing, and that's good. There's nothing wrong with cheap drums. They're great for art projects and hitting with sticks. They probably will not last very long if you abuse them. If you have a band, if you're gigging, if you're touring, then your cheap drums will just break. Every part on it will break. The throw off, the butt plate, the snare wires, the heads, they're all going to snap and they're all going to break. They're not going to stand up to abuse. But if you're a gigging drummer, if your band plays a lot of shows, you've probably been playing drums long enough to not be pondering whether or not to buy a cheap snare. It's not a waste of money if you get a few years out of it and you learn a lot about playing drums. If you're looking to upgrade your kit, you probably want to stay away from the cheap snare option. If you just sit at your house and play drums for fun, a cheap snare will work fine. They can sound really good. What makes them cheap, like most things, is quality of parts, not functionality. A cheap cell phone still accomplishes the same goals as an expensive cell phone. It just doesn't hold up to abuse as well. What's your experience with cheap snares? What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments.